The room smelled like money and pine. White tablecloths, tiny crystal vases with single sprigs of holly. Servers gliding like practiced ghosts between booths. It was New Year's Eve at the Magnolia Room, the kind of restaurant that made you whisper when you thought no one could hear. The whole place glittered with other people's clever decisions. Couples in jackets, groups trading resolutions like IOUs. I was trying to look like I belonged there, because Tyler had set me up, and because the world still expected you to at least show up when someone decided to throw you into that kind of light. I had already rehearsed, in the safety of my head, every reasonable option for tonight. Smile politely, sip something without whiskey in it, leave before midnight. 2 years ago, Emma, had been a spectacular wreck of a thing in my life. She left with Derek, my former business partner, and with half the small success we'd built together. The fallout had a slow, slippery texture. Embarrassment first, then debt, then a long season of not answering the phone because I couldn't bear questions that had no honest answers. I had rebuilt the coffee shop by sweating over every latte and counting till we could cover rent. I kept my head down. I avoided New Year's Eve. So when Tyler texted me a photo of a woman at the bar and said, "She seems cool, show up," I went, because it was easier to be mediocre in public than to be alone at home with a half-empty bottle and a spool of resentments. I hadn't expected Margaret Hayes. She wasn't the kind of woman you could overlook. She had a posture that suggested she'd spent decades organizing things, fundraisers, holiday dinners, the sorts of events that required name cards and the patience of saints. She wore a black coat with a collar that suggested both warmth and armor. Her hair was silver at the temples in a way that made her look like someone who had worn grief and joy as plainly as a winter scarf. She sat at a table for two, a candle burning like an accusation between an unused napkin and a small stack of cash she was counting as if to memorize it. I recognized her because the world of small towns is a tiny, tangled thing. Margaret was Emma's stepmother. Emma had been younger, a bright, furious kind of girl, fast with a joke and faster with a blade. She had burned a lot down and walked out faster than anyone could catch her. Margaret had always been the steady presence behind her, the person who made apologies soft enough to swallow for everyone else's sharp edges. I had only been with Emma for a year, long enough to hold hands through winter and short enough that the betrayal still smelled like new smoke. Margaret had been kind to me then, when Emma and I were a thing, in ways that made the breakup feel like both theft and obliteration. When your ex's family holds you with a kind of reserved sorrow, it becomes part of the wound.
Tonight, Margaret was alone, and the dessert menu had remained unpaid for long enough that the waiter's smile had turned thin. I watched the bar staff exchange glances. A man in a tuxedo whispered something from the doorway. A woman behind a bank of Christmas trees glanced at her watch and then away. The look was small and efficient, the signal that someone had been stood up. I felt it then, this hot, ridiculous flare of indignation that doesn't care about your bank account or your self-preservation. Maybe it was my grandmother Rose speaking in my head, a woman who had given me more nonsense advice than money, but who had also taught me that dignity was something worth defending even when no one else noticed. Or maybe it was a leftover debt of gratitude to Margaret for being decent in a time when the decent thing had been scarce. Whatever it was, it moved through me like a short, bright electric current. I fished in my pocket for Rose's ring. It had been a small, old thing, rose gold, not because Rose had taste that matched the metal, but because the jeweler had run out of higher-grade options when he set it for her. It had a tiny chip in the band from a dropped coffee cup in a kitchen that always smelled of cardamom and the spice she used for tea. Rose had given it to me when she said, "When you need to believe in something again, put this on someone's hand and you'll feel it." I didn't believe in magic so much as I believed in the ceremonial. I believed in gestures that told new stories, because sometimes the human brain needed a script to follow out of grief. So I stood up. I remember the click of my shoes on the tiled floor like sudden punctuation. Tyler watched me with an expression that blended, "What are you doing?" and "Please don't." The waiter opened his mouth and then closed it when he saw me coming. People at neighboring tables trained their phones covertly like birds. I could hear the muffled clink of champagne flutes 9 tables away. The restaurant made room around us without even realizing it yet. "Excuse me," I said, and it sounded impossibly small. Margaret looked up with an expression that measured me in seconds. Curiosity, then confusion, then mild alarm. "Yes," she said. Her voice was careful. It reminded me of the way Emma would tell a joke and try to gauge whether the room was safe enough to laugh. I crouched down as if to tie a shoe. My chest felt like a fist trying to push out. I hadn't planned words, only action, so I let the old ritual take over. I took Rose's ring out of a pocket that had seen too many receipts and a couple of unsent texts. I held it up between 2 fingers like a dumb, sincere prop. "Margaret Hayes?" I asked. The waiter's face went blank. Glasses paused midair. Someone recorded the moment with a hidden phone camera that would later be sharper than any memory. "Yes?" she repeated, slower now. "I know this is absurd," I said quickly, as if that were an apology that would count.
"But you were stood up, and this is New Year's Eve, and
I'm sorry to be theatrical. I'm Jason. I own the coffee shop on Maple. My grandmother Rose asked me to rescue strangers with little gestures, so you're proposing, she said, and there was a half laugh, a disbelief that floated like steam. Not proposing, not really, I sputtered. Not a real proposal. I mean, if you want to keep your evening and avoid this spectacle, I will, if you're willing, I fumbled because my brain insisted on being honest in the worst ways. I'll propose in front of these people. We'll put on a show. It's temporary. I nearly said by contract because that was the cynical, legalistic term in my head, the kind of thing Derek would have said to make it sound practical. Instead, I said, we'll pretend for a bit, so you don't have to sit here counting bills like you're auditioning for pity. She watched me. The room waited like a held breath. I could leave, she said carefully. I could go home. You could do that, of course, I said. But I thought, maybe we could make it like a rescue. Flip the script. The room will laugh and then stop talking about it. It'll look like a sweet story instead of a humiliation. Her face softened in a way that made me more guilty than anything I'd ever done. She was considering the social arithmetic of the moment, how much people would talk, what the waiter would say to his friends, the judgment of a town that liked to turn a misfortune into a narrative. You would do this for me? She asked, and here was the thing I had not expected. Tenderness wrapped in disbelief. For you, I said. Yes, for you, if you want me to. She studied my face for a beat longer, and in that beat I saw something like a ledger balancing in real time. There was fatigue in her eyes, the way someone who had spent a lot of years making excuses for other people could read a room. She was not easily swayed by theatricals. Why? She asked. Because it's wrong, I said. I didn't have a proper moral spine, but dignity was one thing I would defend. Because someone should protect the part of you that doesn't ask for attention. Because my grandmother would be furious if I let you sit there. She laughed unexpectedly, a sound that did not need to be performed. Your grandmother had remarkable confidence in strangers, she said. I have Rose's ring, I said. She told me to use it. She had opinions. Margaret hesitated a second longer, and then she nodded. All right, she said. One brief spectacle, for dignity. The waiter blinked like a man who had been given permission to hold his breath. Phones came up like small, eager flowers. Someone in a tuxedo clapped delicately as if this were a rehearsal of a happier story. The chef sent out a complimentary plate with a flourish I hadn't paid for and didn't know how to refuse. Do you want to stand? I asked, because I suddenly thought I should involve her in the choreography of my impulse. She stood. Up close, I could see how her hands were only slightly trembly. She held herself as if she could be asked to hold anyone's sorrow as easily as a single hand. I went down on one knee like a man who had practiced the motion in front of a cracked mirror. I remember the immediate artificiality of it, the sudden ridiculousness of my knees on the tile in a restaurant where the acoustics were polished for confessions. I held out Rose's ring, which found its place as if it had been waiting for wear. Margaret's eyes flicked to my hands, to the ring, to the faces around us, and then back to me. Will you marry me, Margaret Hayes? I said, and the name felt strange and tender in my mouth. She looked at me the way someone considers a path through a cemetery, with caution and an eye for where the ground might be softer. Will you marry me in order to save my evening? She asked, teasing, but there was steel under it. Yes, I said, if you want. This will be quick. This will be theater. This will be reversible. I promise you, if you want out after tonight, I will not make this worse. She took the ring from my hand. She slid it on her finger with a deliberate movement, like a woman who had learned the economy of choices. It fit strangely, like a borrowed history settling into a new palm. Do you understand? She said quietly. What it looks like. I do, I admitted. And I know I'm the last person who should be performing a rescue. So I'll be honest. I'm trying to fix a small thing with a dramatic move. I'm sorry if it's selfish. I'm sorry if it's stupid. But I'd rather be stupid and brave than complicit in your humiliation. Her laugh this time was softer. She looked around at the room, then down at the ring. My sister is going to have a fit, she said. Rebecca will preen and be furious. Emma, my stepdaughter, will probably have an opinion. Emma, the name landed like a stone. My chest tightened. She's been complicated, Margaret said. She always will be. She met my eyes like someone offering a truce. But tonight I do not want to be a footnote in someone else's bravado.
If you want to play along for 15 minutes, I consent. I stood back up clumsily. The room applauded in the way the restaurant patrons do when they are given a story that requires very little of their participation. A couple of people took photos. A woman from a boutique down the street tapped my shoulder and said, "You're a good man," as if that could be appraised in a single gesture. We ate the complimentary dessert like actors hungry for applause. We posed for the waiter's camera with the genteel smiles of people who were willing to appear happy for the sake of someone else's narrative. I felt absurd. I felt light in a way that made my ribs ache.
Margaret's hand, still ringed, trembled once when she reached for her glass. She glanced at me like an old friend and gave a small, brave smile that had none of the performance left in it. When the meal finished and we stepped out into the cold, Margaret tucked the ring into the pocket of her coat, like she was leaving a bookmark in a story she hadn't yet decided to finish. My phone buzzed once in my jacket. Tyler shot me a look that said, "You did something I can't make sense of, and I'm proud." We paused on the sidewalk. The streetlights drew halos in the breath that came out of us. I offered, as flippantly as a man can, "Coffee?" She blinked. "At midnight?" "At your convenience," I said. "Or mine. I run the place. I can give you the best midnight croissant in town." She hesitated. "You mean the coffee shop with the art on the wall?" "Yes, with the small succulent that keeps dying." She laughed. "All right, one coffee. One small midnight transgression." We walked back to my shop in a way that made no sense at all. The coffee shop at 2 in the morning on New Year's Eve had the kind of quiet that felt like someone had opened a window in me. We sat opposite each other on the vinyl bench, our cups steaming between us. The bell over the door chimed sometimes when a regular arrived and then left. The world felt unusually small and safely private. I apologized, in the way you apologize when your mouth has outrun your ethics. "I should tell you honestly that I didn't plan for any of it," I said. "It was impulsive. It was partly because of Rose's ring. It was partly because I don't like watching people be humiliated, and partly because I am, frankly, tired of my own cowardice." Margaret stared at her coffee. "You're so young to be a martyr on behalf of other people's dignity," she said. "You discovered that for yourself?" I asked, and she smiled with the kind of surprise that belonged to someone who hadn't expected to be found in action. "You know something," she said. 2 months ago, I stood in front of Emma and watched her clap back at a woman who'd criticized her on a forum. Emma's reply hurt both of them. She said something sharp. The other woman lost her balance because she had children. It was messy and public. I've had my share of messy and public. She looked up at me. I suppose I know humiliation when I see it. I also know that sometimes the way people see you can be less true than the thing you feel. I lied by omission in there. I touched the ring sitting in a small dish near the register, already returned to a place of temporary safekeeping. I didn't intend to propose in the sense of the real thing. I intended to stage a rescue. I should have said that outright. I'm sorry. Margaret regarded me like someone reading the ingredients of a cake. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I appreciate the honesty." "Would you be angry," I asked, "if you found out I'd used your evening as, what was it, a prop?" She thought for a long time. "I might be," she said finally, "but being angry is not the same as wanting to be humiliated. There is a difference." We talked until the coffee went cold. She told me about Rebecca, her sister, a woman with an unpreferred outrage that made family gatherings a contact sport. She told me in clipped sentences, the way people do when they rehearsed grief until it's manageable. She spoke of Emma in a hushed, almost reverent way, a woman who had taken a lot of love and given it back in pieces, who had been brilliant and reckless in equal measure. Margaret had stood on the edges of Emma's fires for so long, she had an ash-colored patience for the ways people destroy themselves. "So what happens now?" I asked. "We go back to the Magnolia Room tomorrow and hope no one remembers? We pretend this never happened?" "I could go home and pretend I had an agreeable companion tonight," she said. "But people will always see a woman who was stood up unless you change the story. People are better at repeating the original narrative than they are at noticing the edit." "That's the thing," I said. "We could stage more. Not for yourself. If you want out, I'll be gone. But if you want to avoid the ripple, we can do a little more noise, enough to drown out the whisper." She raised an eyebrow. "Noise?" "A short, staged engagement," I said. The words felt ridiculous and precise at the same time. 3 weeks. We say we're engaged.
We make just enough public appearances so the story is about us, not the man who failed to show. In 3 weeks, the attention will die down. We'll go our separate ways if you want, or if it turns into something else. If you find I'm not entirely a fool, you can decide then. No pressure. No lies besides the ones we're both willing to live with for a short time. Margaret looked at me like someone who had reached across a room of small mirrors and found a reflection she recognized. By contract, she said slowly, the phrase hitting her like a practical thing. You mean like an agreement? Exactly, I said. A written thing if you want. Boundaries, terms, a limited engagement in more ways than one. She tapped her spoon against the ceramic like a metronome. Why 3 weeks? Because it's long enough to make the story stick and short enough to not make anyone miserable, I said. And because I don't want to be the person who invents a life out of someone else's dignity. If this is about shielding you, I have to be willing to stop when you say stop. She pinched the bridge of her nose in a way that suggested fatigue and humor at once. You make a very practical fool, she said. And you make a practical priest of broken things, I returned. We drafted then an arrangement in the margins of napkins and receipts, as if the coffee shop ledger had been turned into a small court of temporary marriage. We did not need lawyers. The town's newspapers don't hold legal weight.
We listed basic rules. No public kisses that were more than cursory. No lies to family beyond the engagement story. A limit to appearances. No interviews, minimal press exposure, no travel. We agreed that I would be responsible for being the public face of the story, because I was the younger, less scrutinized man in the town, and because the narrative of a younger man rescuing a dignified woman would be easier to spin than the reverse. Margaret insisted on one non-negotiable, that she kept full agency over every decision and could withdraw consent for any act at any time, with no explanation necessary. You can ask for coffee at midnight and then decide not to pretend for anyone, she said. I will not be forced into theater. I promise, I said, and it felt like a promise heavy enough to bruise. We shook on it in the absurd way of people who were both laughing and sincere, like two actors taking the same line. Somebody walked by the window and gave our little theatrical handshake a glance. Nothing in the world changed immediately, but in the small universe of the coffee shop, something did. An agreement had been made that turned the impulse into something purpose-built. We would be partners in a lie that was supposed to protect her dignity. The word contract made it sound clinical and dishonest at once, but it allowed us to circumscribe behavior, to write a horizon line around the chaos. We left the coffee shop with the ring back on Margaret's finger. She adjusted her coat as if to acknowledge that she carried a new shape of attention. I walked her part of the way home because old towns are not generous about letting strangers walk alone at night. She talked about Rebecca, who would undoubtedly have feelings about our theatrics. She mentioned Emma's unpredictability in a tone that suggested both love and a small, resigned worry. Are you afraid of her? I asked, which was an ugly question because it implied that she might need protection from her own family. No, she replied. I am worried about what she will say. Worry is different from fear. We agreed, in the half-light of winter, to begin our 3-week charade at dawn. I felt ridiculous again, but in a less theatrical way. I felt the small, heavy thing that comes with doing something that might embarrass you, but might also, if you were brave, be a good thing. There was an edge of guilt so sharp it was almost useful. It kept me honest about intentions. I promised, in the very center of the promise, that if I ever felt my motives had become less pure, I would stop. Margaret promised the same. Before we parted, she turned to me with an honesty that made me want to be better than my own impulse. Jason, she said, if we are doing this by contract, then let it be a contract that always includes consent. Let it be reversible. And when you're ready, tell me why you did it. Don't let this be a thing I have to find out about later.
If you want the truth of your actions to be known, say it early. I will, I promised. I will tell you everything. I will own the fact that I staged your rescue. Good, she said. I prefer honesty with my theater. That night, on my walk back to the shop, my phone buzzed. It was Tyler, followed by a flurry of texts. Do you know you're trending? 2 million views? You're an idiot and a saint. I scrolled to the short clip someone had already uploaded, me down on one knee, the ring flashing terribly in the restaurant light, Margaret's expression teetering between mortification and a kind of amused surrender. The caption read, in 1,000 variants, Man rescues woman from being stood up. I stared at the video until the screen went dim.
The little flame on the ring's metal had become a signal, and now an audience had been invited. That was when the consequences, plausible and messy, started to sharpen at the edges. Reporters don't care for nuance. Strangers are better at quick judgments than slow empathy. And Emma, in my head, she was always loudest. I knew the sound her outrage might make. Sharp, performative, righteous. Still, right then, while the town was stirring and the internet was warming up its machinery, I felt something else. A strange, quiet satisfaction that came from intervening on someone's behalf. It was messy and probably morally complicated, but it was something like a small, honest act. I didn't know then that headlights would follow, and that there would be more than a handful of people who would not buy the contract's practical bent. I didn't know that some corners of the internet would frame Margaret as a prize to be won, and others would call me opportunistic. I didn't know whether our agreement, scribbled on a napkin with a shaky pen, would be enough to stop the stories from running. What I did know was this. Margaret had consented, in a way that mattered. She had agency. She had not been saved. She had chosen an option that kept her dignity intact. And I, who had spent 2 years nursing my own wounded pride, had stepped into the light because I couldn't stand the alternative. The next morning, the coffee shop filled earlier than usual. People wanted to see the man who had proposed in a restaurant and the woman who'd accepted, if only for the novelty of it. I took orders with the same hands that had held Rose's ring overnight, but I kept glancing at the door as if expecting cameras to march in. For 2 weeks, the notifications would be sporadic. A local paper asking for a comment, a blogger requesting a photo, messages of support and scorn in equal measure. The story would breathe and then spread. By noon, Margaret's name and my religiously awkward act of gallantry had become a threat. Someone sent me a screenshot. A local columnist had printed a soft, snippy piece about modern chivalry.
Another friend, genuinely kind, texted a video montage of people applauding acts of kindness. Their caption read, "Choose to be kind." I sat behind the counter watching the town react, holding to the promise we'd made. A short contract, mutual, reversible. The ring sat under glass back at my place like a relic of a play we'd missed rehearsing. I thought of Rose and the absurdity of her injunction, use it when you need to believe. If belief was the currency, I'd spent mine on a public rescue and traded comfort for chaos. By evening, the first reporter called. Her voice was crisp and curious. She asked for details, for a quote, for the kind of sentence that could be excerpted into a headline. I told her, because Margaret had insisted on honesty, that we had staged it, that it was an agreed gesture to protect her dignity, and that we had no intention of playing it out beyond a short period. I tried to be frank and careful, and I said Margaret's name with something like reverence, because she had been both the reason and the conscience behind the stunt. When the interview ended, I felt as if a small seal had been broken. The story now had official oxygen. It moved beyond the raw human moment and into the realm of public narrative. That night, I sat alone with a stack of unpaid invoices, a sink full of coffee cups, and the knowledge that the simplest kindnesses sometimes come with strings you didn't plan for. I thought about Emma and how her face would react when she saw the clip. I thought about Rebecca and how she would pathetically try to fix everything with a casserole and a rebuke. I thought about Margaret, about the way she had consented and yet carried the risk of being talked about like a headline. I brewed another cup of coffee and watched the little circle of steam rise, turning the kitchen light into a fog of possible outcomes. The contract was a practical thing. It was also a promise that we could both break without cruelty. It was also, I suspected with an odd clarity, the first real decision we had both made in a long time, to act and own the act together. I slept badly, with the ring's image burning in my head like a small lantern. When I woke, the town had chosen sides. Some called my rescue romantic, others tactical. A few people messaged me to say that the whole thing looked staged, because it was, and then, paradoxically, to praise the staging for allowing Margaret to step out of shame. The internet's moral calculus twisted itself into interesting shapes. Margaret texted me a single line that morning, "Thank you for last night, for being ridiculous in defense of decency." She added a smiley face that felt like a flag, not a promise, but the kind of small human punctuation that meant she was willing to proceed. I texted back immediately, because I needed to keep my side of the contract honest. I told her, again, the truth, that I had been impulsive, that I had used Rose's ring, that I was sorry if I had turned her into a spectacle. I thanked her for consenting to the plan and reminded her that she could stop at any time.
She replied, "I know. We have a contract. See you for lunch." We met that afternoon under the honest light of noon. There was no music in the coffee shop then, only the steady hum of grinders and the occasional hiss of steam. We sat at the table near the window that I always reserved for people who needed to feel like they had a view of the world. "So," she said, folding her hands around her cup. "Terms?" "Terms," I repeated. 3 weeks, minimal press, no staged intimacy beyond hand-holding in public, no travel. If either of us wants to stop, we stop. We tell exactly as much of the truth as we want, no more, no less. Rebecca stays out of it unless you want her in. Emma, she gets to be told by you if you choose." She nodded, her expression all business. "And what of your motives?" she asked, the question that had been making me nervous since the first buzz of phones in the Magnolia Room. "Are you here out of altruism or some theatrical brand of self-redemption?" I braced myself and then said what I'd been avoiding. "It's both. I wanted to rescue you because I couldn't bear the sight of you being humiliated, but I also wanted to be brave in a way that felt meaningful and not petty. I know that sounds bad." "It sounds honest," she said, and there was a softness in it. Honesty is preferable to an elegant lie. I reached across the table and, after a second's hesitation, I took her hand in mine. It was not a romantic gesture yet. It was an agreement. It was a public handshake between two people who had decided to hold each other's story for a while. We wrote the contract on a piece of stationery from the shop, the sort of thing that had been used to print our coffee shop's logo, now repurposed for something less commercial and oddly more serious. We dated it with the day's number and wrote, "Term, 3 weeks." We listed boundaries, the method of withdrawal, a clause about how to address family inquiries. It was an absurd little document, 2 names, a short list of rules, and 2 signatures that looked like the ends of different genres. When we finished, Margaret leaned back and let out a breath like someone setting down baggage. "There," she said. "We have a contract. We are legally dubious, but morally respectable." We both laughed. Laughter in that moment felt less like a defense mechanism and more like an acknowledgement that we were both choosing to be adults about something that could easily have been a train wreck. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt like I had signed up for a play that would have critics and also family members with opinions. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was not Tyler. The notifications had started to gather, messages from acquaintances, a comment thread that had begun to thread itself into different moral positions, and one message that stood out amid the noise. It was from Emma. Her text was short. I read it 3 times because my stomach did a small, unpleasant somersault with each pass. Saw the clip. We need to talk. I looked up at Margaret. Her face was unreadable for a second, and then she gave me a small smile that was both weary and courageous. "She always has opinions," she said. "Do you want me to call?" I asked, but she shook her head. "No," she replied. "This is my family to manage. I will speak to her. If she wants to confront you, she can, but it will be me who brings her into the room." There was an unspoken kindness in that. She was protecting me from an argument with the woman who had broken me, while also protecting her own autonomy. That night, we had turned an act of impulsive gallantry into an agreement shaped at a kitchen table. The contract was more than a paper, it was a promise to be accountable to each other. When I closed up the shop that evening, the world outside felt different. There were more people paying attention, and attention is a force that compacts into pressure. I locked the door and walked home beneath the skeletal trees that cut black patterns against the sky. Rose's voice, funny, incorrigible, stubborn, took up residence in my head again. If you're going to do something, do it fully. She had meant something different, I think. She had meant commitment in a moral sense, not just the spectacle. But there was still a lesson in it. Owning your actions is heavier work than performing them. I had no idea how messy it would get. I didn't know how much pride and resentment and family history would clamber into our neat little agreement. I didn't know how many strangers would have opinions, or how many friends I'd need to remind that marginal kindness can be complicated. All I knew was that Margaret had chosen to be protected instead of paraded, and that I had chosen, in my clumsy way, to make a story about dignity instead of a story about spectacle. And in the small hours, as the town hummed with comment threads and my coffee grinder cooled, I thought of Rose's ring sitting in my pocket like a small warm stone. I thought of the contract on the paper in my drawer, and of the 3 weeks that lay ahead like a strip of unpainted wall. I imagined the first time either of us might decide to walk away. I imagined, too, the unlikely possibility that this strange, carefully scripted arrangement could become something else entirely. The future, as it tends to be, was stubbornly unknown, but as long as we had agreed to be honest about it, as long as Margaret had insisted on consent at every turn, I felt the shape of a possible redemption that was not simply my own vanity dressed in gallantry. The phone buzzed again just after midnight. It was Tyler with a single link. A local television show had picked up the clip and would be doing a piece on acts of kindness over the holidays. Below the link, he had typed, "Buckle up." I sat on the edge of my bed and read it twice, then a third time. The 3-week contract had become a headline incubator overnight. My chest tightened as I remembered Margaret's face in the restaurant, composed, dignified, not asking for rescue. I wondered how she would respond to the new level of attention. I wondered if the contract we'd written on a scrap of paper would hold against the tide of public curiosity. I turned off the light and let the dark be a mercy. Tomorrow, we would begin the work of living the contract in public, of being a story people could tell without knowing our names. Tomorrow, I would wake up and make the coffee and step into a new sort of performance. I told myself, with the precarious optimism of the morally repentant, that I would try to be nothing more than honest about my motives and steadfast in protecting Margaret's agency. And then I slept in the small, tremulous way of people who have made promises they are not sure they deserve to keep. If you like these impossible little real-life messes that somehow turn into something softer, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from. The first week felt like living inside someone else's headline. The coffee shop got quieter and louder at the same time. Quieter because regulars who wanted privacy stopped coming in, louder because new faces pushed the bell each time the door opened just to say, "You're the man from the video." People wanted to touch the story like it was an object on display. Some tipped kindly, others sized me up as a spectacle. The extra foot traffic helped the rent column on the spreadsheet, which is to say, our stunt had immediate, mundane consequences. The internet does not love nuance, it prefers a good label. We were suddenly the rescue couple, the napkin fiancé, the grandkid savior, and, inevitably, the cougar and her boy toy, which is what the less polite corners called us. Margaret handled all of it with the kind of composure that had always made me respect her. She answered the nicer notes herself. She let me handle interviews when the questions were simple and deflected the ones that felt invasive. When a local lifestyle blog asked for a photo shoot, she said no and then called Rebecca to neutralize the potential fallout. Rebecca called me first, sharp, protective, the sort of person who regards the world like a small family mess she can box into neat corners, and I could practically hear her measuring out phrases before she spoke them. "You two are playing with fire," she said, no preamble. Her voice over the phone was brisk enough to warm soup. "Do not make my sister a footnote in some cheap story." "I know," I said. "We have limits. We have a paper napkin contract." "A napkin contract?" she repeated, incredulous. "It's very legally dubious," I admitted, "but emotionally binding." Rebecca humphed. "Just keep your hands clean. Keep her dignity intact. If you mess this up, I will bake you into oblivion."
Margaret laughed at that and then turned the warmth of it into something that felt like a shield. When people pointed cameras at her, she did something that surprised me. She told small, elegant truths. "People stand you up," she told one reporter, "and sometimes you have to stand yourself up again." Her sentences didn't invite pity. They redirected it. She insisted that any future public appearance be framed around a simple truth about the way small towns gossip and the odd, necessary theater people sometimes use to keep from being eaten alive by judgment. She never once let anyone speak for her. Our little contract held up enough to get us through the initial wave. We made the mental math. 3 weeks, a handful of staged appearances, minimal interviews, 0 magazine spreads. We stuck to it not because we were perfect at following rules, but because it constrained our worst impulses. There's a purity to a self-imposed deadline. It keeps you accountable because it's time-limited. But deadlines also have a funny way of teaching you what you want when you aren't looking for it. It started in small ways. She texted me a recipe for a lemon loaf she used to make for Emma's school bake sales, a recipe written in a practical shorthand that revealed both habit and kindness. I burned the first loaf, charred the corners so badly the smoke alarm judged me. She did not laugh in the humiliating way that burns. She sent me a picture of her dog-eared index card with her mother's handwriting and said dryly, "Try not to recreate the Great Smoke of '99. Then she invited me to help fold programs for a community concert she was volunteering with. We showed up together. It was low-stakes visibility. We arrived as a pair and left as partners in an efficient, if slightly awkward, choreography. There were nights the town's attention felt like a warm hand on the small of our backs, and nights it felt like a crowd pushing too close.
The more we tried to control the narrative, the more people insisted on filling the blanks. A photographer from a regional paper snapped a picture of us walking arm in arm and used a caption that suggested I'd orchestrated a personal comeback. At least 2 comment threads called Margaret vindictive, one called me opportunistic, one called us both brave. The moral calculus is a messy, slippery thing when the currency is public opinion. We lived inside the calculus and slowly learned the limits of what we could control. The cemetery visit came at the end of the second week, not because of our schedule, but because grief has its own calendar. Margaret suggested it. She called one afternoon and said, "I'm going to the cemetery to water the rosemary by Giles's stone. If you have the time, I suppose you could bring a thermos." She said it like practice, not an invitation of romantic possibility, but an offer to share a quiet duty.
I didn't know whether she asked me because I had become someone she could trust, or because she wanted a companion to fend off the small talk of strangers. Either reason was enough. There's a wind in that cemetery that seems to know the names of the people who visit, and it had a peculiar way of pulling at the collar of my coat, as if it were nervous. Giles's stone was modest, weathered granite, a brass plaque. I brought a thermos of coffee that had cooled on the drive over. Margaret knelt like someone practicing a gesture of memory rather than capsizing into it. She tended the rosemary as if it were a living conversation. "You bring coffee like you think grief needs caffeine," she said without looking up. "I bring coffee because it's practical," I replied, "and because Rose taught me the currency of trivial comforts." She smiled and then became still in a way that told me a story without words. "Giles used to say ridiculous things at funerals," she said softly. "He'd lean in and tell the person next to him exactly how they should be remembered, down to the biscuit preferences. It made everyone laugh, which is the best kind of bad taste." "Was he funny in life?" I asked. "He thought he was," she said. "He was loud in the specific way of being married to someone younger. He made mistakes. He left me a lot of quiet to do." She turned and looked at me fully then, not the measured, diplomatic face she used with reporters, but the honest one she kept for small rooms. "Divorce is a funny kind of grief. It's not one thing you mourn. You mourn the version of yourself that believed in a story long after the story had ended." I thought about my own inventory of grief. Rose's kitchen, the loss of a business partner who had turned to honeyed betrayal, the slow evaporation of confidence. "I thought grief had a name you could put on it," I said. "Turns out it comes in shades." She nodded. For a moment, we were only 2 people with thermoses and rosemary and the soft weight of memory. Then she said quietly, "You didn't fall to your knees in the restaurant because you wanted credit. You fell because you saw someone else's shame and wanted to stop it. That matters." "It mattered," I said. "At the time, it felt like a moral reflex. Now it feels complicated." "Complicated is honest," she offered. "You picked up a history you didn't belong to, and you made it yours for a minute. That's not a bad impulse. It does require you to be careful." There was a small, awkward moment then where the air thickened with things left unsaid. I reached out and she took my hand. The contact was brief and mutual, not romantic in an obvious sense, but intimate in a way that made the day seem slower and heavier and truer. That night, I found myself replaying 1,000 small conversations in my head. People often imagine the arc of a fake engagement to be purely performative, the dramatic kisses, the calculated smiles. In our case, the performance was the scaffolding for an unexpected rebuilding. The scaffolding, if handled well, can become architecture. I felt, with a quieting clarity, that I was no longer simply performing protection. I was beginning to want to be present for her for reasons that belonged to me, not to headlines. It was dangerous to name a thing before you understood it, so I said nothing. I simply began to look for her in ways that felt like small habits. Leaving a thermos on her stoop because she liked her coffee no sugar in the morning, saving a table near the window for when she stopped by unexpectedly, remembering she liked the lemon loaf one day burned and the next day perfect. Habits have a tendency to accrete meaning. Emma's arrival in the story was a roar rather than a whisper. She didn't send a passive-aggressive text or a terse comment. She came to the coffee shop in person one rainy afternoon, the bell chiming behind her like anger hitting glass.
She sat down at a table and looked at me as if I'd been a problem set she'd been given to grade. "I watched you play knight," she said, voice clipped and sure. "You do realize this was staged, right?" "I told the press it was staged," I said. "We have a limited engagement, 3 weeks. Margaret and I both agreed to it." "And do you think that's enough?" she asked. "You think a staged proposal erases what happened between us? You think you can buy dignity back with a theater piece?" Emma's words were fast and angry, but not wholly undeserved. I had been hurt by her, betrayed by her and Derek. Blame is a thing people cling to when they are in pieces. She had a right to her anger. The thing that complicated her fury was family. Margaret's face when she heard Emma's accusations, the worry lines around her mouth. Emma's presence made the room smaller and the story more tangled. Margaret rose from the table to stand beside me. She didn't take my hand. She chose instead to stand as herself, like a person stepping into the center of a conversation she had invited. "Emma," she said, plainly, "I asked for this. No one forced me. Jason did not come here with malice. He came because he couldn't bear it." Emma's jaw set. "So you're fine being used as a prop to make him look noble?" "No," Margaret said, "but I am fine choosing how I want to be seen. I am not the object of pity you make me. I can choose theater as armor, or I can choose to sit in shame. I choose the former." Emma's face wavered between triumph and something like pain. "This is still him playing rescuer. He's trying to rewrite his story." "I'm allowed to rewrite my story," Margaret replied, and there was a small fierceness in her voice I hadn't heard before. "If you want to be angry with me. You don't get to carry everyone else's story and then decide theirs for them." Emma stared at her and then, for a moment, at me. It was not a warm look. "So you're really going to go along with this?" she asked.
Margaret is an adult, I said, because I felt like a craven child listening to 2 mature people manage a complicated calculus. She consented. She knows the terms. If at any point she wants out, we stop. Emma's reply was a disgusted exhale. "I don't like the optics," she said. "Neither do I," Margaret answered, "but I would prefer to control my narrative rather than be controlled by someone else's absence." Emma left without a dramatic exit, just a door and rain, and a slam that registered more in the bell than in a theatrical flourish. That night, she posted a long thread on social media accusing me of opportunism and calling Margaret names that I will not repeat. Comments folded into comments. Strangers debated the ethics of our arrangement as if we were case studies in a moral philosophy class. Margaret called me later that evening. "She had a right to be angry," she said, voice taut but steady. "But she is entitled to her feelings, not to decide mine. I will not live as a footnote in someone else's righteous fury." I told her then, in a way that made me feel like I was stepping into confession, that I was sorry for not framing things properly from the beginning. "I should have told you everything before the crowd," I said. "I should have been more honest about my reasons." "You have been honest since," she said, "and you've done the harder work of letting me have the final word on my dignity. That's what matters." There were moments when I wanted to make grand gestures to erase the mess I'd helped create. I wanted to buy a billboard that said, "Margaret Hayes chooses herself." I wanted to write a long essay about dignity and performative compassion. But those are the kind of theatrical moves that look good in a headline and poor in real life. The work of restoration is the small stuff. Showing up, keeping to the contract, apologizing without caveats, letting someone decide. The shift from charade to something honest did not happen in one cinematic instant. It happened in the accumulation of tiny refusals to be small with each other. It happened when I told her, truthfully, that I had been lonely for a long time in a way that was not ennobling but very human. It happened when she told me about the way the years wear you down until you either choose yourself or let others choose you. It happened in the quiet of my kitchen when we ate a proper, not burned lemon loaf and drank from mugs instead of paper cups. One evening in the second week, after a particularly invasive set of articles, we closed early and I made a dinner that was nothing fancy. A pan of roasted vegetables, the remainder of a chicken I'd learned to cook badly and sometimes better. Margaret arrived, shrugged off her coat, and for once didn't offer a speech to any stranger who happened to pass by the window. We ate at a table near the back, where the light was forgiving. "You look tired," I said. "So do you," she replied.
"You're doing more of the heavy lifting than I am," I said. "You're the one managing family and public opinion." "It's my life," she said simply. "I can choose who gets to be in it." We talked about loss, again, because grief is the place where truth often lodges.
She told me, in fragments, about the wedding that had not gone according to plan, about the late birthdays and the quiet absolutions she had had to learn to give herself. I told her about Rose and the kitchen and the small ways my life had been sanded down by betrayal and poverty. We laughed at some of it, made small jokes, and then fell quiet. The night had the kind of silence that means you don't have to fill it. "You are not trying to fix me, are you?" she asked, suddenly, and with an earnestness that made my chest tilt. "I don't think I'm capable of fixing anyone," I said, "but I would like to be someone you can trust, if you want that. I would like to be somebody you could choose." She reached across the table and took my hand. The gesture was deliberate, not theatrical. "I choose my decisions," she said. "You can be part of them if you want. That's the difference between being rescued and choosing someone." We kissed for the first time not as a concession to a script, but as an agreement to explore something. It was careful and consensual and not particularly cinematic. 2 lips, awkward at first, then warming. There was no trumpet fanfare, only the honest small electricity that comes from mutual choice. Afterward, we sat and made no promises that we could not keep. That felt like a vow in itself. Of course, this softness would be tested. The internet is with us until it is against us, and in week 3, a local TV show wanted a human interest piece. We had agreed to minimal press, but the show called with a polite urgency and an anchor who sounded like she'd been trained to find the sentimental seam in any story. Margaret answered the phone while I was rearranging a display. She listened for a long moment and then told them no. The producer pushed for a compromise, just 15 minutes, a short conversation. "Not today," she said, "and not even then unless I say so." I was proud in the private, sloppy way that happens when someone you care about asserts their boundaries. It was a small victory, refusing to turn our lives into entertainment. We were protecting the private gravity so the public could not flatten us. The last few days of the contract were the strangest. Part of me wanted to mark the end with some spectacle, one last flourish of the theater we'd been using to hide, and part of me wanted to be humble and small. I vacillated between the two and landed somewhere in the middle. If the stunt had started as a rescue, the conclusion, if there was to be one, had to be honest. A week before the contract expired, I sat down with the ring in my hand. Rose's ring had become a talisman and a problem.
I'd shown it publicly. I'd used it as theater. I'd used it as a symbol of a protection that felt necessary and at times performative. I owed Margaret the truth about what I'd felt when I first held it in the restaurant's light. I owed her a clearer articulation of why I had kept going, why the charade had become more than a gesture. That afternoon she had errands, and I'd arranged for the shop to be closed for a couple of hours. I turned a corner of the place into something that felt private. A little cluster of candles, a pot of her favorite mint tea, a small saucer with the lemon loaf that had finally learned how to behave. When she came in, she looked surprised, and then steady. The town's attention had not let us forget that people were watching, but for a moment, the place felt like it had been reclaimed for us. "I'm glad you came," I said, and then, less confidently, "There's something I need to say." "I'd like the truth," she said, "but you knew that." "I used you as armor," I said. "I used my grandmother's ring to make a story that might shield you from humiliation. I thought I was acting out of decency. I also thought I needed to prove something to myself about being brave. That mix was selfish and in ways clumsy. I'm sorry." She listened. There wasn't the sharpness you might expect, just a quiet that had been earned. "I know," she said, "and I know what it is to be used as a symbol. I consented, Jason. Consent matters more than intentions sometimes. Your apology is not a free pass, but it is a start. I don't want to be a start and then vanish," I said. "I don't want this to be a chapter I enjoyed until it's convenient to close." I fumbled, and then did the thing that felt like both the right and wrong answer. I got down on one knee. It was foolish and real at the same time. People never plotted small private proposals in the same way they do a stunt. They are usually either planned or instinctual. This one was both. The ring in my hand felt heavier now, because it had been used, misused, and perhaps redeemed. "Margaret Hayes," I said, and I tried to make the sentence honest in a way that had not always been true. "I proposed to you in a restaurant to stop an indignity. I apologized for that, and I have tried to be honest. I used a ring that belonged to my grandmother, and with it I asked for a temporary thing. That was a poor start. But I am asking now, without cameras, without a script, will you marry me? Not as theater, not as a protective device, but as someone who wants to be chosen and to choose you in return." Her hand went to her mouth, not to cover gasps, but as an old habit of thinking through something large. The silence stretched like an honest thing between us.
In the background, the shop hummed its soft noise. "You're aware of the absurdity?" she asked, and a small laugh escaped her. "I am aware of everything absurd about me," I said, "and I am aware of my faults." She sat down carefully, balancing the kindness and the burden of the question. "You are asking me to trust that your motives have changed," she said. "You're asking me to accept risk. You're asking me to marry a man who staged me in front of strangers." "I'm asking for a chance," I said, "to make things that were wrong be right in ways that matter. I can't promise I'm perfect. I can promise I will always respect your agency, your choices, and your right to withdraw." I sounded like a man reading a list he'd learned by heart. "I promise honesty. I promise I'll never make you a prop again. I promise to learn how to be a better partner." She looked at me for a long time, and I felt my pulse like a small drum in my neck. "You've already promised a lot," she said. "You promised a contract. You promised to stop. You promised to be honest. None of those promises are small." "I'll say them again," I said. "I promise. I apologize for the original deception. I ask for permission to move forward, knowing full well the starting line was flawed." She took the ring from my hand and turned it between her fingers. The light from the window caught its small chip and made it look like a comet. "You have been clumsy, Jason," she said. "You've also been genuine in your clumsiness more often than not. That counts for something." "And you," I said, "have been remarkable." She smiled. "You are very prolific with praise." I meant it. She placed the ring back on her finger, and then, with a small, steady movement, took my hand. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. Not because the internet told me to, not because you saved me, but because I choose to. I'm frightened and ridiculous and strangely hopeful. I am not willing to promise you forever today, but I am willing to begin." We stood then, and no cameras clicked. No one posted it to a timeline because it was private, and private things have their own kind of dignity. I felt like I was finally walking into a new story that wasn't entirely given to me. There were practical things to do. We told Rebecca in person because I could not handle another phone conversation. She arrived with a casserole and a scowl that softened in stages. She hugged Margaret like a woman reconciling her own fears with someone else's joy. Emma texted, then called, and the phone conversations were jagged and real. She wanted to know whether this was a stunt to humiliate her or a genuine step. Margaret answered directly, honestly, and Emma listened. I won't pretend reconciliation came in a clean sweep, but the edges of her anger began to sand down towards something that had room for conversation. The town's interest did not evaporate overnight. There were opinion pieces, and a commentator who called it all a publicity stunt, even after we had explained the consented contract. There were ugly comments about age and motivations.
There were also kind notes from people who had been stood up at other tables and wanted to say that someone had cared enough to stop the small cruelty. Life, as it does, continued to be a mixture of applause and jeers. We learned to take the applause with gratitude, and the jeers as something to be ignored, or, occasionally, corrected with fact and decency. Marriage planning is, in many ways, less cinematic than the idea of it. We did not hire planners or rent ballrooms. We invited a small group, family and a few close friends, because a wedding should start as a covenant among people who know the history of the couple, not as a spectacle for strangers. We secured a date that felt right, not by astrology, but by availability and comfort. Something mid-October when the light was good and the town's gossip had settled into its quieter rhythms. On the day we made the decision legal in the small way we could, signatures in a municipal office, a small gathering, a woman who officiated with the kind of blunt kindness you only find in small towns, Emma came. She wore a dress that looked like armor and then like a soft apology. She did not give a speech, but she stood in the back and watched. Rebecca cried. My hand shook when I put a ring, one newly chosen with both of our tastes consulted, on Margaret's finger. It felt absurdly and wonderfully like the closing of a circle. People still talked. The internet still had opinions. Some of the same folks who'd called us a stunt called us inspirational the next week. I tried not to be swayed. The important things, food for the shop, kindness to our neighbors, the quiet rituals of mutual respect continued at the center. Sometimes I think about the question that started it all.
Why did I get up and rescue a stranger in a restaurant? It's less murky now. I acted from a mixture of things: remorse, the desire to help, the need to prove myself, and an inherited sense of ritual from a grandmother who thought objects could be anchors. But intention matters less than action and the work you do after the action. I apologized. I wrote a contract. I let Margaret decide every step. I tried, over and over, to be honest. We are not immune to judgment. We are also not defined solely by the moment we staged under the Magnolia Room's polished lights. We are two people who chose to face the messy consequences of something clumsy and to try, deliberately and imperfectly, to build something real from it. In public, people sometimes smile at us and say, "You two saved each other." I never quite credit myself with being a savior. Usually I say, "We tried not to let each other be small." That feels more accurate. It recognizes that protection can look like theater if it's part guard and part intentional choice. It recognizes that dignity can be defended in imperfect ways, and that the important part is making room for the agency of the person you claim to protect.
We still keep the contract spirit alive, even if the napkin is now framed and in a drawer. We keep the principle that consent can be withdrawn. We keep the promise that honesty trumps image, and that apologies are not a currency for redemption, but a practice of repair. We keep small rituals: lemon loaves on rainy afternoons, rosemary on Giles's stone, a seat held near the window in case one of us needs to be seen without being judged. People ask whether we ever look back and wish we'd done things differently. Of course. There are nights I wish I'd been more articulate in the restaurant, or less performative in my youth. There are times Margaret wishes she had been less willing to accept my impulsive rescue. Those regrets are not disqualifying. They are the honest ornaments of lived life. What I know now is simpler and harder and nicer than any headline. Dignity matters. Agency matters more. Being brave is less about the gesture and more about living with the consequences that follow. And love, if that is the word we want to use, was not a fix for grief or an antidote for shame. It was, for both of us, a deliberate picking up of each other's burdens and a choice to walk forward anyway. A year later, we still get the occasional stranger who leans in and says, "You two were a story." We smile and say, "Yes, we were." They want to know whether it was real. We tell them the honest thing. It started as a rescue and turned into a choice. The surprising part is how ordinary that choice has been. Laundry and arguments about space for plants, the way we forget to call one another when the day gets busy, the softness of small apologies. It is, in its ordinariness, the part I cherish most. When people ask whether I regret the theatrics, I tell them I regret the clumsy parts and treasure the good ones. I tell them I am grateful I felt indignation instead of numbness that night at the Magnolia Room. I tell them that Margaret did not need saving. She needed to be allowed to decide how she wanted to be seen. I tell them I asked for forgiveness and then spent the rest of my life trying to deserve it. If I have learned anything, it's that saving someone is not the same as choosing to be chosen back. That humility is a daily practice, not a single declaration. That consent must be given freely every day if it is to mean anything at all. And that dignity, once reclaimed, can become the basis for a life that is messier and truer than any performance could capture. If you stayed with this story to the end, thank you. If you want to hear another strange rescue turned real-life mess, subscribe. There are more messy choices out there, and I'll tell you about them.